No, ninguno de esos.
Sé que me dio cuenta. Que vas a traducir nomás.
Thanks, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Erin Switelski, and I am a board member with Community Action for Justice in the Americas here in Missoula. And we are very excited to have our good friend, Scott Nicholson, who has been down in Colombia for the past couple of years doing accompaniment work with great organizations like Nydia's. We're happy to have him back tonight and very happy to have Nydia up here on tour in Montana. She's done several presentations across the state now and has spoken to many, many people, so she's excited to be here tonight as well. Before we get started, I want to thank all of our sponsors who made this event possible tonight. So we had Students for Economic and Social Justice here on campus at the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center, MUD, the Missoula Urban Demonstration Project, Garden City Harvest, the Department of Social Work, the Big Sky Students for Economic, Social, and Environmental Justice, the Bitterroot Human Rights Alliance, the Environmental Studies Department, the Montana Human Rights Network, the IWW Three Rivers Chapter, and University Congregational Church. So thank you to all of those sponsors. Before we get started, I wanted to give a little gift to Nydia for her travels. So I was going to present her with a very exciting CAJA t-shirt available for purchase up front, if anybody is interested. And we have these wonderful shirts here. I'd like to give it to Nydia. Muchas gracias. Also tonight, during the presentation, once we get started, we'll be handing out some postcards. These are postcards to President Obama asking him for a new direction on Colombia policy. So we'd appreciate if everyone could sign a postcard and just go ahead and leave them on the ends of the rows, and we will collect those at the end of the night and make sure that those get to President Obama. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Scott to do a formal introduction of Nydia.
Well, thank you all very much for being here this evening. And again, the sound is okay? Everybody can hear and back all right? So yeah, thank you very much for being here tonight, for coming out to hear Nydia Castellanos. For me, it's a real pleasure to be back here in Missoula again. And what I'd like to do is just give a little bit of background in terms of the situation there in Colombia before turning it over to Nydia. And in terms of the work that I'm doing there, I've been able to, for the last 3 years, provide what's called international accompaniment there in Colombia. Just an international presence alongside human rights activists like Nydia, people who've been threatened by the military, the right-wing paramilitaries, and the idea is that those folks are less likely to follow through on those threats in the presence of international witnesses. It also gives me a chance to see the impact of our tax dollars there in Colombia. So what we wanted to do at the beginning of the presentation this evening is that oftentimes when we hear about Colombia, we hear about drugs, we might hear about the violence going on there. We don't hear about what an incredibly beautiful country Colombia is. We wanted to start with some shots of that. Yeah, and so how, in terms of just going to dim the lights a little bit so you can see the photos a little bit better.
Sorry, just remember.
There we go. All right. Oops. So this is the Cocuy mountain range in the eastern range of the Andes, and that peak in the center there is about 18,000 feet high. This is the eastern range of the Andes from the town of Saravena in the state of Arauca in northeastern Colombia. This is the Satocao River, one of the many rivers that flows down from the Andes. This flower is lirio. This is a flor amarillo, yellow flower. Those are actually blossoms on the tree, and that happens right before rainy season starts again. That animal is chihuidro with her young, and chihuidros are animals there of the eastern plains, the size of about a small to medium-sized dog. Get the herons, and you can see in the back a red heron there roosting. And then the herons flying home to roost in the evening. So very beautiful country, very beautiful cultures as well. These are, whoa, that was not, was not trying to do that. We'll see if we can step it back a little bit to those very beautiful cultures that I was going to comment about. So anyway, these are Ua indigenous children performing one of their traditional dances. And these people are dancing a joropo, which is the traditional dance of the plains, a very fast-paced, intricate dance. And they start dancing that at a fairly early age, which explains why they're so good at it. And then just in terms of a little bit of where we're located, and see how I do with a little red, there we go. So Colombia is that one up there in the northwestern corner of South America. And then in terms of the state of Arauca, where we're at, it's right there. Northeastern part of Colombia, we've got the 3 ranges of the Andes come up from the south. We're out in the plains, and then right there is the Arauca River forming the border between Colombia and Venezuela. So Arauca's got a tremendous amount of natural resources. Colombia does as well. Colombia's got a lot of gold, coal, oil, fresh water. Arauca in particular has got a lot of oil. There's a lot of oil being produced right now and also a lot of new exploration going on. Most of that being done by a couple of corporations. Oxy is Occidental Petroleum, a US-based corporation, and Repsol is a Spanish corporation. Oxy discovered oil there in Arauca back in '83. The Caña Limón oil field that's now producing about 100,000 barrels of oil a day. So with oil roughly around $50 a barrel, it's about $5 million a day that's leaving the state of Arauca in a pipeline going up to the Caribbean coast and from there being shipped up here to the US. It would work out to over $1.5 billion every year that's leaving the state of Arauca. So on the one hand, you have all these tremendous natural resources there in Colombia, but then on the other, most of the people are living in poverty. About 2/3 of the people live in poverty. I would describe that situation as economic violence. And these are Guaibo indigenous children. When Oxy discovered oil in the area that's now Caña Limón, it was near the Lipa Lagoon, which was a sacred site for the Guaibo indigenous people. And I guess in order to be able to put your oil wells in, you need dry land. So what Oxy did, they blocked off 7 of the creeks that fed into the Lipa Lagoon, basically drained the lagoon, destroyed that sacred site, and then displaced the indigenous people from their lands. This is also one of the root causes of the war there in Colombia, the tremendous disparity between the wealthy few that have a lot of wealth and then the vast majority of the people who are living in poverty. So in terms of the war, it gets kind of confusing at times to keep track of who's who, but basically you've got 2 sides. On the one side you've got the military, the police, and the paramilitaries. And the other side you've got 2 guerrilla groups. The paramilitaries for their part are private armies that were formed by the drug traffickers, the large landowners, the wealthy businessmen back in the mid-'80s as a way of fighting back against the guerrillas. But very early on, the paramilitaries began targeting the civilian population, people that they viewed as supporting the other side. And the paramilitaries have basically done the dirty work for the military, the things that they don't want to be seen in public doing to their own people. So in terms of threatening, displacing, and killing people that they view as supporting the other side. And the relationship between the military and the paramilitaries has been very extensively documented by groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. There was a process of negotiation several years ago between the paramilitaries and the government. Thousands of paramilitary fighters laid down their weapons, but there's concern that that process is just going to result in impunity. More than 90% of the paramilitary fighters will not face any kind of criminal charges for the human rights abuses that they committed, and their top commanders, as long as they publicly confess to their crimes, get greatly reduced prison sentences, no more than 5 to 8 years in prison. And some of those folks have now confessed to ordering or participating in the killing of hundreds of people. Again, the maximum sentence for them would be 8 years. And then last year, when some of the paramilitary commanders began talking about the connections they had with government officials, military officials, suddenly Colombian President Álvaro Uribe agreed to the extradition request from the United States, and more than a dozen of those paramilitary leaders were extradited here to the US, not to face charges for human rights violations, but just for drug trafficking charges. So on the other side, and one of the things that the military is doing at this point in time, you'll be hearing about this evening, are killing civilians and then presenting them as guerrillas killed in combat. And the other thing, just the mass arrest of civilians on charges of rebellion, mainly community leaders. So on the other side, you've got 2 guerrilla groups, the largest of which is the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. The guy in the photo there was Manuel Marulanda. He died last year. There's another smaller guerrilla group, the National Army of Liberation, the ELN. And it seems to me that when those groups got started back in the mid-'60s, they had a pretty clear political vision. They were fighting for social justice, land reform for the peasants, and other programs. But it seems to me that after fighting against the paramilitaries for the last 20 years, the guerrillas have basically become just the mirror image of the paramilitaries, using the same tactics in terms of threatening, displacing, and killing people that they view as supporting the other side. And the situation in Arauca has gotten so bad that the two guerrilla groups there, the FARC and the ELN, over the last 3 years have been fighting against each other and mainly targeting the civilian population, again, the people that they view as supporting the other side. So in the midst of all that, you've got U.S. military intervention. During 2000, Bill Clinton pushed through Congress what was called Plan Colombia, a massive increase in U.S. military aid, using the justification of the war on drugs, being as how most of the cocaine consumed here in the U.S. comes from Colombia. So he traveled to Cartagena on the Caribbean coast, August of 2000, met with Andrés Pastrana standing next to him, who was the president at that point in time, to announce the disbursement of the first funds from Plan Colombia. At that point in time, Congress was very concerned about the human rights situation in Colombia, so they attached 7 human rights conditions to that aid, things that the military and the government had to do there in Colombia before that aid could be dispersed. Clinton, for his part, suspended 6 of the 7 human rights conditions, citing interests of national security, in order to be able to disperse those funds. So now Hillary Clinton is Secretary of State. On February 25th of this year, she met with Jaime Bermudez, who's the foreign minister from Colombia, met with him there in Washington, D.C. So support from the U.S. government is continuing to the Colombian government and military. Since 2000, the U.S. has given more than $5 billion in military aid to Colombia, and basically all that has done is just to worsen and prolong the war there in Colombia. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire. The last thing the people in Colombia need are any more weapons coming into the country. What they need instead is spending on social spending, healthcare, education, decent housing, jobs, and alternative crops for the peasants so they don't feel forced to grow coca in order to be able to provide for their families. The other thing the U.S. has done is support the aerial fumigation of more than 2.5 million acres with the herbicide glyphosate. It's Roundup manufactured by Monsanto. It does impact the coca plants, but also affects people's food crops and causes health problems for people in the areas that are sprayed. And after having sprayed 2.5 million acres in Colombia since 2000, the amount of land there in Colombia planted in coca is actually larger now than it was when all that fumigation started. So that money would be much better spent here in the States on drug rehabilitation and education programs. So in terms of the beneficiaries of our tax dollars there in Colombia, this reads, Plan Colombia, the gringos provide the weapons, Colombia provides the dead. United Technologies manufactures the Black Hawk helicopters. There were 18 of those given to Colombia as part of Plan Colombia. United Technologies got $234 million for that. Textron manufactures the Huey helicopters. 42 of those were given to Colombia as part of Plan Colombia. Textron got $81 million. Monsanto manufactures the herbicide used in the spraying. They get millions of dollars a year for that. And finally, DynCorp is a corporation basically of mercenaries, retired soldiers, soldiers for hire, and they've got the State Department contract for drug eradication and interdiction in Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Pakistan, the main focus being there in Colombia with the aerial fumigations, and for that they're getting $174 million per year. So Nydia flew into Portland from Bogota on April 3rd. On April 4th, we drove from Portland here to Missoula, going over Lookout Pass, which was the first time that she had seen snow in her life. We got there about 3:30 that afternoon, so she also had a chance to watch some of the folks snowboard and ski there. And Nydia, for her part, got involved with human rights issues when she was 10 years old in 4th grade. She was elected to be the personera in her elementary school. And the personera is the student human rights official, so she was responsible for looking out after the human rights of the other students in the elementary school. So she's been involved with human rights issues for more than 20 years now. She's currently the Secretary General of the Arauca Peasant Association, which promotes organic agriculture and works to defend the human rights of its members. And for that work, her life is very much at risk. The initial Secretary General of the Peasant Association, Flor Diaz, was arrested in 2006 on charges of rebellion and spent 3 years in prison. Another Secretary General, Carlos Cabrera, was killed by the guerrillas on November 28th of last year. This is also the first time that Nydia has been away from her family for any period of time. She was able to call them just about an hour ago prior to the presentation. So and you'll be seeing her family in just a little bit here, but it's very difficult for her, it's very difficult for her kids, the separation, but she felt it was worth that sacrifice to be able to come up here and share with us the situation there in Colombia, particularly there in Arauca, and what we can do about it. In the presentation this evening, she'll be talking first about the situation in her state of Arauca, a section called Oil, War, and Poverty. and then the vision of the Peasant Association, the work that they're doing, the repression that they're experiencing because of that vision for social justice that they have, the resistance of the people there in Adrauca to that repression, and then finally what it is that continues to inspire her to keep on with the struggle for social justice. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nydia.
Gracias. Mi nombre es Nydia Castellanos.
My name is Nydia Castellanos.
Tengo 32 años, de los cuales la mayor parte de estos años los he dedicado a la defensa y promoción de los derechos humanos.
I'm 32 years old, and for the main part of my life, I've dedicated my life to the promotion and defense of human rights.
Esta es mi hermosa familia, ellos son mis hijos.
This is my beautiful family, my children.
Ella es mi hija menor, Melissa, tiene 5 años.
This is my youngest daughter, Melissa. She's 5 years old.
Melissa con algunos de sus amigos.
Melissa with some of her friends.
Él es mi padre, se encuentra con mi hija en el río Arauca, que es frontera con Venezuela.
This is my father with my daughter, Melissa. They're there in the Arauca River, which is the border between Colombia and Venezuela.
Ella es mi hija, Diana Camila, tiene 9 años.
This is my daughter, Camila, who's 9 years old.
Mis hijas también practican el baile del joropo, que es el baile típico de los llanos orientales.
And my children, my daughters also dance joropo, which is the traditional dance of the plains.
Y él es mi hijo mayor, Brandon, tiene 12 años.
This is my oldest child, Brandon. He's 12 years old.
Mi país es un país muy hermoso, rico en minerales.
My country is a very beautiful country, very rich in minerals.
El petróleo es un gran mineral que existe en el departamento de Arauca.
So petroleum is a very great mineral that exists there in Adrauca.
Lamentablemente la explotación de este mineral ha generado una guerra y por lo consiguiente el resultado de eso es una terrible pobreza en mi departamento.
And unfortunately, the exploitation or the production of that mineral has generated a very grave war, which has caused a tremendous amount of poverty in our department, in our state.
Esta es una valla que se encuentra ubicada a la entrada del complejo petrolero de Caño Limón.
This is a billboard at the entrance to the Caño Limón oil complex.
Según Ecopetrol y la Oxy dice zona de protección ecológica.
According to Ecopetrol and Occidental Petroleum, this is an ecological protection zone.
Esto es la zona de protección ecológica.
This is the ecological protection zone.
Uno de los tantos pozos petroleros de la empresa Ecopetrol.
One of the many oil fields owned by Ecopetrol and Occidental Petroleum.
Este pozo se encuentra ubicado dentro de un resguardo indígena en el municipio de Gibraltar.
This oil well is located in an indigenous reserve in the county of Gibraltar.
Una de las cientos de tanquetas que tiene la fuerza pública en Colombia se encuentra ubicada en el municipio de Salamina frente a la iglesia católica.
One of the hundreds of tanks that the government security forces have there in Colombia, this one is parked in front of the Catholic Church in Saravena.
Los señores del ejército dentro de un hospital con sus armas.
The men of the army inside a hospital, a public hospital, with their weapons.
En el departamento de Arauca se encuentra un conflicto interno entre las dos organizaciones guerrilleras FARC y ELN.
In the state of Adrauca, there's an internal conflict going on between the two guerrilla groups, the FARC and the ELN.
Este conflicto ha generado cientos de asesinatos y un desplazamiento masivo.
So that conflict has caused the killing of hundreds of people and also massive displacement.
Esta es una de las tantas veredas del departamento, se llama Pueblo Seco y como ustedes pueden ver está completamente vacía.
This is one of the many communities there in Adrauca. This is called Pueblo Seco, and as you can see, it's just completely desolate.
La mayoría de la zona rural del departamento de Arauca está desolada.
The majority of the rural area in Adrauca is completely desolate.
Los habitantes han tenido que abandonar sus viviendas por cuidar su vida.
The people have had to abandon their homes in order to be able to protect their lives.
Afortunadamente, las organizaciones defensoras de derechos humanos internacionales han estado ayudando a las víctimas de la violencia en Colombia.
Fortunately, the international human rights organizations have been helping the victims of violence in Colombia.
Alguna de estas organizaciones es ACNUR.
One of those organizations is ACNUR, which is the United Nations High Commission on Refugees.
Ellos se encuentran ubicados en una invasión.
They're located where this photo was taken, is in an area called the land invasion.
Para los que no sepan qué es una invasión, es cuando los campesinos que han salido desplazados de sus tierras
And so for those of you that don't know what a land invasion is, it's what happens when peasants who have been displaced from their land
por sobrevivencia ocupan terrenos que están desocupados en los municipios o ciudades.
So to be able to survive, they then come into the cities, the towns, and take over vacant pieces of land.
Esa es la invasión del 4 de diciembre en el municipio de Saravena.
So this is the December 4th land invasion there in Saravena. It's called December 4th because that's the day that it was founded on in 2007.
Como ustedes pueden ver, las personas viven con muchísima dificultad.
So as you can see, the people live in very difficult situation, very difficult conditions.
Hay cientos de niños. En el año 2006 salieron desplazadas en el departamento de Arauca 2,000 familias.
So there's hundreds of children in this situation. During 2006, there were 2,000 families that were displaced in the state of Arauca.
Así es la manera que viven los desplazados en el departamento.
So this is how the displaced are living there in the state.
Hay muchísimas mujeres con sus hijos en cada familia. Por lo menos hay 3 niños.
So there's a lot of women with their children. In each family, there's at least 3 children.
Este puente se encuentra sobre el río Caranal, colapsó a mediados del 2008.
This is the bridge over the Caranal River, which collapsed in the middle of 2008.
Con gran dificultad los habitantes tienen que pasar el río para poder movilizarse a otros municipios.
So it's very difficult for the people there to be able to cross the river, then go on to the other municipalities, the other counties on the other side.
Todo esto quería mostrárselos porque el departamento de Arauca es muy rico en minerales, genera muchísimo dinero.
So I wanted to show all of this to you because Arauca is very rich in minerals. It generates a lot of money.
Existe en Colombia que el gobierno de Estados Unidos está dando muchísimo dinero.
And also the United States government is giving a lot of money to Colombia.
Pero lamentablemente, tantísimo dinero que hay, no hay para inversión social.
But unfortunately, even with all of that money, there's not money for social spending.
Lamentablemente, por eso quería mostrarles estas diapositivas.
So sadly, that's why I wanted to be able to show you these photos.
En Colombia existen muchísimas organizaciones sociales.
There are a lot of social organizations that exist in Colombia.
Mi asociación campesina de Arauca tiene una visión.
My association, the Peasant Association of Arauca, has a vision.
Y nosotros hemos estado generando proyectos productivos en agricultura orgánica.
And we've been implementing productive projects in organic agriculture.
Estas son unas plantas de yuca.
These are some yucca plants, which is a root crop.
Todo se siembra a base de abonos orgánicos e insecticidas orgánicos. Acá se está elaborando uno de los abonos orgánicos.
So everything is planted using organic fertilizer, organic insecticide. Here they're preparing organic fertilizer.
Se prepara con lombrices,
using worms
estiércol de ganado.
and manure.
Helecho, esta es una planta que se encuentra en la selva.
Ferns, this is a plant that's found in the forest.
También se utiliza la cal y también se utiliza la melaza, que es un producto derivado de la caña de azúcar.
And lime is also used with molasses, which is derived from cane sugar.
El compañero que está fumigando es un compañero de una organización internacional de acompañamiento, IPO.
The compañero, our beloved companion, is an international compañero who's fumigating there. He's part of an international accompaniment organization called IPO, which is the International Peace Observatory.
Ellos están fumigando las plantas con los insecticidas o abonos orgánicos.
And so they're spraying the plants with the organic, either the insecticide or the fertilizer.
Eh,
Whoa. We'll try and
Para nosotros poder ejecutar estos proyectos tenemos la necesidad de tener el acompañamiento internacional por seguridad propia y por seguridad de nuestros campesinos.
And for us to be able to implement these projects, we need to have international accompaniment for our security and also for the security of the peasants.
Estas son las planticas de yuca.
So these are the yucca plants.
La yuca está apta para el consumo en un año.
So the yucca can be consumed after 1 year.
También sembramos plátano,
We also plant plantains,
todo a base de abonos orgánicos e insecticidas orgánicos.
and all of that using organic fertilizer and organic insecticide.
En los proyectos se dictan talleres en agricultura orgánica y también se les enseña a los estudiantes el impacto que tienen los agrocombustibles.
And part of the projects, there are workshops that are given about organic agriculture and also the impact of agrofuels.
Los agrocombustibles es la reforma agraria que quiere implementar el gobierno.
Agrofuels is the agrarian reform project that the government wants to implement, and the young girl here is reading a booklet about the impact of agrofuels.
El gobierno quiere sembrar alimentos, algunos alimentos como la caña de azúcar para producir biocombustibles.
The government wants to plant food crops like sugarcane, but to use that to produce biodiesel.
Después de la teoría, los estudiantes pasan a la práctica.
Then after the theory, the students go out to the practice.
Este solo animal de los llanos orientales se llama la danta, es la mascota de la Asociación Campesina.
This is an animal of the Eastern Plains. They're in Colombia. It's called the danta, and it's the mascot of the Peasant Association.
El plátano ya un poco más grande,
Now the plantain's a little bit larger.
ahí ya está listo para parir, para dar su fruto.
Now ready to produce fruit, what's referred to as parir, like giving birth.
En las maticas de maíz,
The corn stalks,
su fruto, todos estos alimentos salen de excelente calidad porque son a base de abonos orgánicos.
and all of these crops come out that produce a very excellent harvest because they're grown using organic fertilizer.
Y lo mejor de todo es que podemos conservar nuestras semillas nativas.
And the best thing about all this is that we're able to conserve our native seeds.
Todo este trabajo que hemos estado implementando las organizaciones sociales, en especial la Asociación Campesina de Arauca,
So all the work that the social organizations have been implementing, and in particular the Peasant Association of Arauca,
ha generado una fuerte represión del gobierno en contra de nosotros.
has generated a very grave repression from the government against us.
Y no tan solo del gobierno, sino de los actores armados.
And not just from the government, but also from the armed groups.
Debo decirles que la junta directiva de la asociación se encuentra toda en condición de desplazada.
So I have to tell you that all of the members of the board of directors of the Peasant Association have been displaced.
Todos mis compañeros tienen amenazas de muerte, con excepción mía.
And all of my compañeros, with the exception of myself, have death threats against them.
Aquí me encuentro cuando era la representante de derechos humanos de mi vereda y a mi lado se encuentra Francisca, que ella era la presidenta de este comité. Salimos desplazadas de allí.
And this photo was taken when I was responsible for human rights in my community. And next to me is my compañera Francisca, who is the president of the community association there in the community. After this, both of us had to be or were displaced from our community.
Ella es mi compañera Flor, en esos momentos se encuentra en la cárcel.
This is my compañera Flor. When this photo was taken, she was in prison.
Ella fue acusada de rebelión por su trabajo y pasó 3 años y 4 días en la cárcel.
She was accused of rebellion and spent 3 years and 4 days in prison for her work.
Salió bajo libertad condicional.
She was released on parole.
El Comité Permanente para la Defensa de los Derechos Humanos organizó una visita a los presos.
So the Permanent Committee for the Defense of Human Rights organized a visit to the prisoners.
En esta visita pues se les llevaba útiles de aseo, un refrigerio, un grupo musical para amenizarles un día porque los días en la cárcel son deprimentes.
So they brought in personal hygiene products, lunch, and also some musical groups for them to be able to enjoy that day because life there in prison is very depressing.
Estas son sus hijas y su nieta. Ella es Marcela Viviana.
So these are her daughters and her granddaughter. On the right is Marcela, in the middle is Viviana, and then her granddaughter.
Marcela tenía 18 años cuando su madre cayó en la cárcel.
Marcela was 18 years old when her mother was imprisoned.
Ella debió asumir la responsabilidad de su familia bajo escasos recursos económicos y sin trabajo.
So she had to take on the responsibility for her family with very limited money and without any work.
Son sus hijos Edwin y Fernando.
These are her children. On the left, Edwin. On the right, Fernando.
Su hija, la hija de Marcela, esta bebé nació el 20 de diciembre de 2006.
This is the daughter of Marcela, who was born on December 20th of 2006.
Realmente para Marcela un poco difícil porque no tenía trabajo y debió enfrentar pues el parto de su bebé y al mismo tiempo estar pendiente de su casa.
So that was a difficult situation for Marcela because not only did she have to give birth, but then she also had to take care of the household, and again without having any work.
Esa niña es hija del anterior presidente de la asociación, José Caicedo.
This girl is the daughter of the previous president of the Peasant Association, José Caicedo.
Él se encuentra exiliado porque tiene orden de captura y amenazas de muerte.
And he's currently in exile because there's an arrest order out for him and also death threats.
Él es nuestro actual presidente y su esposa, él se llama José Antonio Amaya.
This is our current president and his spouse. His name is José Antonio Amaya.
En esos momentos se encuentra en el municipio de Saravena y afortunadamente nos dimos cuenta que el B2, organismo de inteligencia del Ejército Nacional, lo iba a asesinar.
When this photo was taken, they were living in the town of Saravena, and fortunately at that point in time we found out that the B2, the intelligence agency of the Colombian military, was going to kill him.
Pues tocó sacarlo del departamento.
So we had to take him out of the state.
Él tiene 3 niños.
He's got 3 children.
Su hijo Duan, su hijo menor.
This is his youngest son, Duban.
Y sus otros 2 hijos, Michael y Brian.
And his other 2 children, in the center, Michael, and on the right, Brian.
Este es otro líder de la asociación campesina quien se encuentra enfrentando cargos por rebelión en la cárcel de Arauca.
This is another leader of the Peasant Association who's in prison in Arauca City on charges of rebellion.
Él fue capturado en enero del 2008 junto a 12 líderes sociales.
He was captured in January of 2008 along with 12 other community leaders.
Su familia, la señora de Rosado, su esposa, esta señora se encuentra en grave estado de salud.
So that's his family. The woman with the pink blouse is his spouse, has very grave health problems.
José Sánchez era el único que generaba recursos para su hogar y debido a esto pues sus hijos el año pasado debieron dejar de estudiar.
So José Sanchez was the only person who was earning money in the household, and when he was imprisoned, his children had to stop going to school. There weren't the funds to pay for their schooling. That happened last year.
Esta es una de las tantas avionetas que tiene la tarea de fumigar los cultivos de coca.
This is one of the many planes that has the task of fumigating the coca plants.
Yo viví en carne propia cuando iniciaron las fumigaciones en el departamento de Arauca.
I lived in my own flesh when they began the fumigations in the state of Arauca.
Y les cuento que el Ejército Nacional tiene la tarea de limpiar la zona por donde va a pasar la avioneta.
So I tell you that the military has the responsibility of clearing the zone where the fumigations are going to take place.
Y para ellos limpiar la zona es ametrallar casas, potreros, cultivos, sin importar si hay población civil o no.
And for them to clear the zone, that means machine gunning houses, pasture land, crops, and not being concerned whether or not there are people there.
Mi historia es que cuando estaba embarazada de Melissa, mi bebé menor,
So my story, my situation is that when I was pregnant with my youngest daughter, Melissa,
ese fue en el año 2000 que iniciaron las fumigaciones en el departamento de Arauca.
that was in 2000 when the fumigations began in Arauca.
Yo me encontraba dentro de la vivienda y mis hijos se encontraban en los cultivos de plátano.
So I was inside the house. My oldest children were outside in the plantain grove.
Nos dimos cuenta que el helicóptero empezó a rafaguear por donde estaban mis hijos.
And so we heard that the helicopter was beginning to machine gun near where my children were at.
Mis hijos salieron corriendo para la vivienda y pues yo era consciente de que podían rafaguear también la vivienda, entonces me salí para que los señores del ejército me vieran.
And so my children came running to the house, and I was aware that they could machine gun the house. So I ran outside with my children where we could be seen.
De igual manera, pues ellos me vieron porque el helicóptero estaba bien bajito y rafaguearon más o menos a 50 metros de donde me encontraba.
And they could see us because the helicopter was flying very low and they still machine gunned about 50 meters away from where we were.
Luego de terminar de rafaguear, nos fumigaron, incluyendo a nosotros, fumigaron los potreros, fumigaron los cultivos de plátano, de yuca, de maíz.
And so then after they finished machine gunning, then they fumigated us. Well, the fumigation came down on ourselves and also the crops, the pasture, the plantains, the yucca.
Los cultivos empiezan a morir días después. Después de unas 2 a 3 semanas, todo parece un desierto, se mueren las plantas, se muere la comida, se mueren los árboles.
So the plants begin to die a few days later. After 2 or 3 weeks, everything dies off, the food crops, the trees.
Lo único que no se mueren son las plantas de coca.
The only thing that doesn't die are the coca plants.
Las hectáreas que han estado erradicadas, que han sido erradicadas, es porque los campesinos han decidido erradicarla manualmente.
The acres of land that actually have been eradicated because the peasants themselves have decided to manually eradicate those crops.
Lo único que han hecho con las fumigaciones es acabar con la alimentación y la naturaleza.
The only thing that they've done through the fumigations is to finish off the food crops and also nature.
Este es el compañero Martín Sandoval, él es presidente del comité permanente. En esos momentos se encuentra de visitante en la cárcel.
This is our compañero Martín Sandoval, the president of the Permanent Committee for the Defense of Human Rights. When this photo was taken, he was there in the prison as part of that visit.
Ahora hace parte de los cientos de presos políticos que hay en Colombia.
And now he's part of the hundreds of political prisoners that exist in Colombia.
Fue capturado en noviembre del año pasado junto a 14 líderes sociales, incluyendo un médico.
So he was arrested in November of last year along with 14 other community leaders, including a doctor.
Y está enfrentando cargos de rebelión.
And he's charged with rebellion.
La ficha dice libertad para Martín Sandoval y los centenares de presos políticos de Colombia.
The poster reads freedom for Martín Sandoval and the hundreds of political prisoners in Colombia.
Este es el edificio de las organizaciones sociales donde vive Scott. Sufrió un atentado terrorista en noviembre del año pasado.
This is the social organizations building in Saravena. This is where Scott lives. There was a terrorist attack against the building in November of last year. There was an explosive that was set off in the entrance.
Afortunadamente solamente hubieron daños materiales, víctimas no.
So fortunately there was just material damage. There weren't any victims.
Y con mucha tristeza les cuento que el muchacho que se encuentra de camisa rosada era secretario general de la asociación y fue torturado y asesinado el año pasado por las guerrillas.
With a lot of sadness, I tell you that the compañero on the right with the pink shirt, who previously had been the Secretary General of the Peasant Association, he was tortured and killed by the guerrillas in November of last year.
Y el compañero de blanco, él es el presidente de los desplazados en el municipio. Después del asesinato de Carlos, él tuvo que salir del departamento también porque lo iban a asesinar.
And the compañero in the white shirt there is Wilson, who's the president of the Displaced Persons Association in Adraquita. After Carlos was killed, Wilson had to flee from the state.
Su funeral.
During the funeral, the wake,
uno de los arreglos florales de los desplazados.
A floral arrangement given by the Displaced Persons Association from Adraquita.
Ella es su madre.
It's his mother.
Ella es su esposa y sus 2 hijas.
His spouse and their 2 children, their 2 daughters.
Ahí ya vamos camino al cementerio.
And here's where you're going to the cemetery.
Ellas son sus 2 bebés, Clara Lisbeth y Luz Linay.
There are 2 babies. On the left there is Clara Lisbeth, who's 3 years old, and on the right, Luz Linay, who's 8.
En este municipio vivo yo, es el municipio de Arauquita.
This is the town in which I live, Adraquita.
Esta calle es el terminal de transportes del municipio.
This is pretty much the transportation terminal there in the county.
Las 2 últimas semanas del mes de marzo vivimos un paro armado entablado por las guerrillas de la FARC.
During the last 2 months of March, we experienced an armed transportation stoppage which had been declared by the FARC guerrillas.
Cuando se entablan estos paros, nadie se puede movilizar.
And when a stoppage is implemented, nobody can travel in vehicles,
Ni siquiera dentro del municipio.
not even within the town.
Quien desobedezca esta orden es asesinado.
Anybody that disobeys that order is killed.
Producto de este paro, asesinaron a un trabajador de la OXY.
As a result of the stoppage, somebody who worked for Oxbow Petroleum was killed.
Asesinaron a un taxista y quemaron varios vehículos.
There was a taxi driver who was killed and various vehicles were burned.
Y el último día, para rematar, asesinaron a 3 personas en una misma casa en el municipio de Saravena.
And then on the last day, there were 3 people who were killed in the same house in the town of Saravena.
Si se agudiza el paro, la crisis se incrementa porque los alimentos se acaban.
And so as the transportation stoppage escalates or extends, there's also shortages of food.
Como ustedes pueden ver, la represión es bastante fuerte a nuestro trabajo.
So as you can see, the repression is very strong against our work.
Pero nosotros seguimos resistiendo. Muestra de esto es que todo el pueblo araucano está cansado de la violencia.
But we continue resisting, and an example of that is that all of the people in Arauca were tired of the violence.
Las organizaciones sociales en Arauca logramos ejecutar la primera audiencia pública en el municipio de Arauquita.
The social organizations, we were able to achieve the realization of the first public hearing in Arauquita.
Muchas víctimas denunciaron desgarradores testimonios
A lot of the victims denounced or gave their very heart-rending testimony.
ante la Cámara de Representantes y delegados diplomáticos defensores de derechos humanos.
And before representatives from the House of Representatives and also international diplomats, human rights defenders.
Como ustedes pueden ver, en el departamento de Arauca vivimos militarizados por todas partes,
So as you can see there in Arauca, we live militarized all over.
algo que también genera un gran riesgo para la comunidad porque en cualquier momento la guerrilla puede hacerle un hostigamiento a la policía o el ejército y de por medio está la población civil.
This also causes a very grave risk for the civilian population because at any point in time, the guerrillas could attack the soldiers or the police, and the civilian population would be in the middle.
Esta fue la bienvenida que se le dio a la honorable Cámara de Representantes. Dice no al desplazamiento forzado.
So this is the welcome that was given to the Honorable House of Representatives. The banner reads, "No to forced displacement."
Dice no a las detenciones masivas, injustas y al debido proceso.
This reads, "No to the mass unjust arrests, yes to due process."
Como ustedes pueden ver, la comunidad está cansada, responde a todas estas actividades.
So as you can see, the community is very tired of all this and responds to comes out for the various activities.
Yo fui la encargada de leer la ponencia a nombre de la Asociación Campesina.
So I was the person responsible for reading the declaration by the Peasant Association.
Desafortunadamente, no puedo decir mentiras y lo que denunciaba era en contra de la policía y el ejército.
And unfortunately, I can't tell lies, and what I denounced was against the military and the police.
El comandante del ejército y el comandante de la policía se pusieron muy enojados conmigo.
The commander of the military, who's pictured here, and the police commander became very angry with me.
Ella es la esposa del líder que se encuentra detenido, José Sánchez, y sus 2 hijos.
This is the spouse and the 2 children of the leader, José Sánchez, who is in prison.
Parte de esta resistencia se pudo también organizar una protesta después de la captura masiva de noviembre.
So part of this resistance is that we were able to organize a protest after the mass arrest that took place in November.
La Iglesia Católica en el departamento de Arauca pues no tiene muchos recursos, pero es un organismo que ha estado ayudando a las víctimas de la violencia.
The Catholic Church there in Arauca, although it doesn't have a lot of economic resources, it has been helping the victims of the violence.
Ellos recogen mercados para las personas más necesitadas.
So they're able to put together food packets for the people who are most in need.
Dictan talleres a los niños, a las mujeres.
And they also provide workshops for children and for women.
Y también nos apoyaron en la protesta que se organizó, celebraron la misa, dieron algunas palabras.
And they also supported us during the protest. They carried out the mass and shared a few words.
Dice no a la violencia de los derechos humanos. La gente reclama que ya no más violencia.
So this banner reads, "No to the violation of human rights." The people are calling out for an end to the violence.
Eso es la protesta, los familiares reclamando a sus víctimas, ya sea que estén encarceladas o o estén asesinadas.
So this was the protest, the people calling out for their family members, people who have been imprisoned or have been killed.
Estas dos niñas son hijas, las dos niñas son hijas de la compañera que vino el año pasado a hacer la gira, María Ruth Sanabria.
So these two girls are two of the daughters of the compañera who came here last year on the speaking tour, María Ruth Sanabria.
Dice, por el derecho y el respeto a la libertad de expresión.
And it says, for the right and the respect of the freedom of expression.
En Colombia es un derecho que nosotros podamos expresarnos libremente, pero lamentablemente en mi comunidad eso es un delito.
It's a right in Colombia for us to be able to freely express ourselves, but unfortunately in my community that's a crime.
Por exigir nuestros derechos nos asesinan, nos encarcelan.
For demanding our rights, we're killed, we're imprisoned.
Ustedes dirán, bueno, en medio de toda esa represión, ¿qué será lo que les anima a seguir adelante?
So you might say to yourselves, in the midst of all this repression, what is it that inspires you to keep on struggling?
Se los voy a decir personalmente.
I'll tell you personally,
A mí lo que más me anima a seguir adelante es el dolor que llevo en mi alma.
so what mainly inspires me to continue forward is continue with the struggle is the pain that I feel in my soul.
Estoy cansada que en un país tan rico donde llega tanto dinero,
I'm tired that in a country which is so rich and in which there's so much money that is coming in there,
especialmente en el departamento de Arauca donde hay tanta riqueza,
and in particular in the state of Arauca where there's so much wealth,
no es justo que los habitantes del departamento de Arauca vivan así de esa manera.
it's not just that the people of the state have to live in these conditions.
Esto no es digno para ningún ser humano y menos para un niño.
That's not a dignified situation for anyone, much less a child.
Y para mí, lo que más me anima a seguir luchando y a seguir trabajando, que no me importa, soy consciente de que tengo un riesgo bastante grande, que son mis hijos.
And for me, the thing that most inspires me to continue working, continue struggling, I'm not concerned about the fact that I'm at risk, are my children.
Por mis hijos voy a seguir luchando, voy a seguir trabajando en defensa y promoción de los derechos humanos.
For my children, I will continue working, I will continue struggling for the defense and the promotion of human rights.
En realidad, lo que les he mostrado es una mínima parte a lo que realmente nosotros vivimos a diario.
And really what we've shown you here is just a minimal part of what we live daily.
Hemos estado consultando el correo y quiero contarles que esta semana en el departamento han asesinado 12 personas.
We've been checking email, and I would like to tell you that during this week in the state, 9 people have been killed.
Hoy hablando con mi hijo, él me contó que se dio cuenta cuando asesinaron a un amigo de él.
And today when I was talking with my son, he told me that he had found out that a friend of his had been killed.
Entonces, como ustedes comprenderán, estamos cansados de tanta cosa
So as you can understand, we're tired of so many things.
que no tiene sentido.
So many things that don't make sense.
Yo les pido a ustedes que son ciudadanos norteamericanos.
So I would ask of you as North American citizens,
Estados Unidos está generando muchísimo dinero a Colombia para financiar la guerra.
the United States is giving a lot of money to Colombia to finance the war.
Exigir que por favor estos recursos se inviertan en obras sociales.
To please demand that money be spent on social spending.
En Colombia hay muchísimas armas suficientes para exterminar a toda la población colombiana.
In Colombia, there's already a lot of weapons, enough to completely exterminate all of the Colombian population.
Y si no se va a invertir este dinero en obras sociales, entonces que no den nada.
And so then if the government doesn't want to invest this money on social spending, that it not give anything.
Agradezco a ustedes el haber sacado un tiempo para venir a escucharme.
I thank you for having taken your time to come here and listen to me.
Estoy dispuesta a responder lo que ustedes quieran.
And I'm willing to respond to any questions that you might have.
Y nuevamente, muchas gracias.
And again, thank you very much. Well, before we get into open it up for questions and answers, just want to mention a few things that you can do about the situation in Colombia. There are some information sheets that we put together that are on the back table. And I would encourage you to pick one of those up on your way out this evening. It's got information that you can use to write a letter to the editor to get word out about what's going on in Colombia, or to contact your congressional representatives, Representative Rieberg, Senators Baucus and Tester, urging them to vote against any additional military aid to Colombia, to stop the fumigations, and also to vote against the free trade agreement that was negotiated by the Bush administration with the Colombian government. Were that to be approved by Congress, that would create an even more difficult situation for the peasants there in Arauca and in Colombia who are not able to compete against subsidized industrial agriculture from here in the U.S. It would likely force even more of them to grow coca as the only way of being able to survive and provide for their families. The information sheet on the back has also got websites you can go to for additional information. Some of those sites are in Spanish, so you can practice your Spanish. And I'm in the process of putting a blog together called The Colombian Journey, just with my reflections about Arauca, and that site is on there as well. And finally, there are a few organizations that organize delegations to Colombia. So if you're interested and want to go down and see for yourself what's going on there, it's got information about our contact information for those organizations as well. So again, I would strongly encourage you to pick that up on your way out this evening. And another thing you can do is we'd like to invite you this evening to join with us in terms of helping to cover the cost of the tour and also to support the organizing work of the Arauca Peasant Association. The arrangement that we've worked out is that after the cost of the tour are covered, all the rest of the money that we raise during the 4 weeks that Nydia will be here in Montana, Washington, and Oregon will then go to the Arauca Peasant Association for their organizing efforts there in Arauca. So we'd like to invite you to join with us in that this evening, supporting that work. If you'd like to make out checks, tax-deductible checks can be made out to CAJA, CAJA, for Community Action for Justice in the Americas. So we'll just start routing this around, and then with that, just like to open it up to any questions, comments, or critiques that anyone might have. And for my part, again, thank you all very much for coming out this evening and for listening to Nydia. It means a lot to her. It also means a lot to myself and to all of our sisters and brothers there in Arauca and Colombia.
I'd just like to say thank you, Nydia, and thank you for all the things that you're doing.
Me gustaría decir a usted, Nydia, muchas gracias por venir acá y muchas gracias por todas las cosas que usted está haciendo.
Gracias a usted por venir.
Thank you for coming here. So anyone at all, any questions or comments? Janet?
Thanks for being here. Thank you for being here too. Is there any news
Gracias por estar.
within Colombia about what is happening in Arauca, or is it silenced within the media of the country as well?
¿Hay algo en los medios de comunicación allá en Colombia sobre lo que está pasando allá en Arauca, dentro de los medios allá en Colombia, o está un silencio completo sobre lo que está pasando allá en Arauca?
Hay un silencio completo porque los medios de comunicación no dicen lo que está pasando.
So there is a complete silence because the media doesn't announce what's going on or broadcast what's going on.
Si vivieras en Colombia, vieras las noticias de los dos canales que son Caracol y RCN. Por lo general nunca se ven noticias de Arauca.
So if you're in Colombia, you would see the two TV stations, which are Caracol and RCN, and they never show news from Arauca.
Cuando sale una noticia de pronto que han capturado un cabecilla de la guerrilla o...
Yeah, if there is any news that comes out of there, it's maybe when a guerrilla commander has been captured there.
Pero de la realidad nunca muestran nada en ninguna parte.
But the reality is never shown anywhere.
How do the people of Colombia view the United States being involved in the war?
¿Y cómo ve la gente allá en Colombia, de los Estados Unidos y su involucramiento en la guerra por allá?
Las víctimas de la violencia lo ven muy mal. Son conscientes que de pronto los ciudadanos no tienen la culpa porque...
So the victims of the violence, view the United States very poorly. Perhaps they might realize that, the people here don't necessarily have the responsibility for the violence.
Sienten mucho resentimiento entre la administración de Estados Unidos y muchísimo más resentimiento ante la administración de Colombia, que ellos al fin de cuentas son los que tienen más la culpa.
So they feel a lot of resentment against the U.S. administration, in particular, against, even more so against the Colombian administration, the Colombian government, because they're the ones that are directly responsible. ¿Le gustaría decir algo sobre la administración nueva o algo de esperanza? Okay, bueno.
I feel like, thanks for coming again.
De nuevo, gracias por venir.
As often as I sometimes hear similar stories like this from more rural areas of the country,
Muchas veces escucho historias semejantes de otras áreas rurales del país.
I feel like I've also spoken with a handful of Colombians from more populated areas of the country
También he hablado con algunos colombianos de lugares más poblados
who have expressed, and maybe this is exceptional, but that the increased military presence during the Uribe administration
quienes han expresado, y tal vez es la excepción, que la presencia militar más fuerte durante la administración de Uribe
has led to improvements in places where they feel comfortable traveling that they hadn't maybe 5 or 10 years ago.
ha resultado en algunos mejoramientos y la habilidad de viajar, donde tal vez hace 5 o 10 años ellos no podían viajar.
And La Magdalena Medio, for example, or
Sí, por
similar
ejemplo, en la Magdalena
situations.
Medio.
If military funding is removed, do you worry that there are areas of the country where these gains will be lost, or are these gains illusory?
Entonces, si se para la ayuda militar, ¿usted está preocupado que se podría perder estas ganancias o mejoramientos en esos lugares? ¿O esos mejoramientos son simplemente una ilusión?
Pues, a ver, en los departamentos de Colombia existe una situación bastante difícil.
In the states in Colombia, there's a very difficult situation
En todos los departamentos.
in all of the states.
Pero sucede una cosa, que hay dos partes en la guerra.
But what's going on is that there are two sides in the war.
En una parte está policía, ejército, paramilitares,
So on one side, you've got the police, the military, the paramilitaries.
y del otro lado están las dos guerrillas, FARC y ELN.
On the other side, you have the two guerrilla groups, the FARC and the ELN.
El gobierno tiene una guerra de exterminio a las guerrillas,
So the government has a war of extermination against the guerrillas,
lo que agudiza muchísimo más porque en el departamento de Arauca pues hay bastante presencia de guerrilla.
which has escalated things quite a bit because there in the state of Arauca, there's a lot of guerrilla presence.
Entonces es muchísimo más fuerte la represión del gobierno en el departamento.
So the government repression is much stronger there in the state.
Lamentablemente las personas por vivir en esta zona, pues para el ejército, para el gobierno son guerrilleros también.
And unfortunately, for the people to be able to survive in those areas, they're then considered by the government and the military to be guerrillas.
Y pues es un problema muy difícil para los habitantes porque ellos están en medio de los que tienen las armas.
And it's a very difficult situation for them because they're in the midst or in the middle of the people who have the weapons.
Entonces, como se dice en mi país, tienen que marcharle a todos.
And so, as they say in my country, everyone has to march.
En otros departamentos la violencia es por las masacres que originan de pronto los paramilitares.
In other states, the violence might be as a result of the massacres that were carried out by the paramilitaries.
En general, en todos los departamentos hay violencia en contra de los derechos humanos,
In general, in all the states, there's violation or violence against human rights
ya sea de una o de otra forma.
in one way or another.
Pero si se acaba la ayuda militar,
But if the military aid was to end,
en gran parte se puede mejorar porque lo que sucede es que están explotando los recursos más ricos en Colombia, como es el petróleo, esmeraldas, oro.
but that could help the situation because what happens is right now they're extracting or exploiting the resources that are in Colombia like oil, gold, emeralds.
Para la explotación de estos minerales se necesita muchísima inversión.
And to be able to carry out that production, they need a lot of investment.
Y de todas maneras, eso también origina una fuerte guerra porque necesitan sacar a los campesinos o comprarles su tierra a bajos precios para poder explotar estos minerales.
And that has also caused a very grave war because they either have to push out the peasants or buy their land at a very low price to be able to extract those resources.
Entonces la guerra se origina por todas partes y de todos los medios y por cualquier cosa.
¿Cómo?
Entonces la guerra se origina por todas partes en Colombia,
And so the war that is existing is going on there in all the areas of Colombia.
ya sea por una cosa o por otra, pero hay guerra y hay violencia.
So for one reason or another, there's war and violence throughout the country.
First of all, I'd just like to, I guess, just thank you. Yeah, thank you for coming out here. I think it's a tremendously courageous thing to speak out against this oppression, let alone travel to
Es una
another
cosa
country.
de mucha valentía de hablar en contra de tanta represión.
I had a few questions, and maybe you might be able to help answer them as well.
Tengo
When
algunas preguntas y tal vez usted me podría responder.
my first question is, when did the U.S. start funding the war in Colombia?
La primera pregunta es que ¿cuándo comenzó a financiar la guerra en Colombia y los Estados Unidos?
Do you think that
Well, maybe we can start with that one just real quickly. You know, my understanding of that, and we got Paul Haber here as well, can correct me if I'm mistaken, but the war there in Colombia started back in '64, and very early on, in the early '60s, there were U.S. military advisors that were going down there to advise the Colombian military. So pretty much from the beginning of the guerrilla war going on there in Colombia, there has been U.S. support for the Colombian military. And then again, that military intervention escalated sharply in 2000 when President Clinton pushed through Congress Plan Colombia.
do you believe that it's kind of ignored, that the effects of this funding is kind of ignored in Congress, or that people are unaware of it?
¿Y cree que allá en el Congreso no se conoce sobre los impactos de este financiamiento o que sí saben?
Por supuesto que sí saben,
Very definitely they do know.
pero igual la meta de ellos es muy clara y pasa por encima de lo que tienen que pasar.
But their goal is very clear, and so they will, step on whoever they have to. And as far as that goes, the State Department, as part of the aid going to Colombia, the military aid, the State Department has to certify that Colombia is improving its human rights record every so often. I'm not sure if it's every 6 months, every 12 months, what have you, and ever since Plan Colombia began. And so whenever that process takes place, groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Washington Office on Latin America, they send in reports documenting all the human rights violations that are going on, and yet the funding is approved once again and continues.
And this is the last one. Has there been one politician, even just one that has stood up and tried to make clarity of all this?
¿Usted ha conocido a un solo político que ha tratado de ponerse allá en la raya y hacer algo?
Sí he conocido algún político que no sea corrupto, pero sucede que cuando llegan al poder por seguridad propia, por resguardar su vida, tienen que volverse corruptos a la brava.
So I have met, some people, some politicians who were not corrupt, at least when they began. But then once they've taken office, then oftentimes to be able to, just protect their own lives, their own situation, they're just sort of forced to become corrupt. So yeah, and back. En español, la pregunta.
Hola Livia, mucho gusto. Mi nombre es María José. Gracias por venir. Y lo que te quería preguntar es ¿qué posibilidades reales existe a una salida del conflicto armado, a una salida pacífica que, según he leído, muchas organizaciones, incluso algunos dirigentes políticos como la diputada o senadora, no recuerdo, Piedad Córdoba, están llevando adelante en Colombia? ¿Y qué posibilidades existe en Colombia de que otro partido político diferente al de Uribe en este momento tenga un buen resultado en la salida del conflicto, ¿no?
Sí.
Well, the question basically, a little bit difficult for me to hear you from up front here, but in terms of if there's a possibility of an end to the conflict, if there might be a political party that would support that process, was that the, okay.
Primero que todo, en Colombia existe un partido de izquierda que es el Polo Democrático Alternativo.
There is a left-wing party in Colombia, the Democratic Alternative Pole.
Pues hasta donde va, pues tiene como buena fuerza.
It has a lot of strength.
Algunas ideas son buenas.
Some of its ideas are very good.
De pronto ese sea un partido, pues, de esperanza.
And so that could be a party of hope.
Y las organizaciones sociales sabemos exactamente que la única salida a la terminación de esta guerra es la inversión social, que se acabe la pobreza, que haya alimentación.
And so we as the social organizations know perfectly well that the only way to end this war is that there be social spending, to do away with poverty and with hunger.
La Asociación Campesina está luchando por la seguridad y soberanía alimentaria.
The Peasant Association is struggling for food security and sovereignty.
Lo primordial para el ser humano es su alimentación,
The most important things for people are food.
debido a que la han acabado en algunos departamentos como en Arauca, por eso se ha generado más la guerra.
And being as how that those food crops have been wiped out in some states like Arauca, that has increased or escalated the war even further.
Entonces nosotros creemos que las ayudas sociales es la única salida a esta guerra.
And so we believe that social aid is the only way to end the war.
Y acabando la inversión militar.
And to ending the military spending.
Next door to the east is Venezuela and Chavez.
Venezuela y Chávez.
What is the relationship with Chavez? Does he support? Does he stay neutral? Does he support the leftist party? And is there in Colombia a desire to emulate what Chavez is doing?
¿Qué es la relación de Chávez con Colombia? Él está neutral, está al lado de los partidos de la izquierda y hay deseo allá en Colombia de copiar o poner en práctica a las políticas de Chávez también.
La relación que tiene los presidentes de Colombia y Chávez no es muy buena.
The relationship between the president of Colombia and President Chávez is not very good.
Hace poco salieron de una crisis diplomática debido al asesinato de Raúl Reyes en Ecuador.
And a while back, they came out, there was a diplomatic crisis because of the killing of Raúl Reyes, a FARC commander in Ecuador.
Realmente el presidente Chávez, pues lo respeto mucho.
I respect President Chávez a great deal.
Él tiene su manera de pensar, su manera de dirigir a su país.
So he has his way of thinking, his way of administering the country.
No sé si él esté a favor de la izquierda en Colombia.
I'm not sure if I'm not sure, I wouldn't know how to say to you whether or not he's in favor of the left in Colombia.
Lo que sí le puedo decir es que el gobierno de Venezuela ha sido muy colaborador con muchísimas personas colombianas que se encuentran exiliadas en Venezuela.
What I can tell you is that the Colombian government has collaborated a lot with people from Colombia who are exiled in Venezuela.
En Venezuela hay muchísimos colombianos y el gobierno venezolano los ha ayudado.
There are a lot of Colombians in Venezuela, and the Venezuelan government has supported them, has helped them. Other questions or comments? Going back?
Yeah, I was looking at like, there's like, if you're not giving you any money, like, would you have backup plan from there? Like, yeah.
So if the United States was to stop giving the military aid, if there would be a backup plan, is that what you're asking for?
Yeah, like if the United States was throwing in more money.
Okay, what would be the alternative?
Yeah.
Okay. Si los Estados Unidos pagarían la ayuda militar, ¿qué sería como el plan B o la alternativa? Es como la pregunta.
Si Estados Unidos para la ayuda militar,
If the United States was to stop the military aid,
favorecería muchísimo, sobre todo a los campesinos,
that would really favor the situation primarily of the peasants,
que son los que han sido más golpeados por esta situación.
which are the ones that have been most affected, hit the hardest by the situation.
Y el plan B ya lo tenemos en ejecución.
And the plan B we're already implementing.
Estamos tratando las organizaciones sociales de trabajar
So we as the social organizations are attempting to work
de la mano de organizaciones internacionales defensoras de derechos humanos,
together with international human rights organizations,
que son los que más han estado ayudando a las víctimas de la violencia en Colombia.
which are the ones that have been most supporting the victims of the violence in Colombia.
Y ese es el plan B. Estamos trabajando en proyectos productivos
And this is plan B, this is the plan B. We're working on productive projects.
y el propósito es seguir creciendo con estos proyectos por beneficio de todos los campesinos y de la comunidad en general.
And the goal is to continue with these projects, for these projects to increase, to benefit the peasant population and all of the people. Anyone else in the back?
How much does money play in? I'm just thinking, I'm just wondering, like, do peasants have a monetary base? And how much does it might be due to the fact that they're not, I don't know, are they hooked into the monetary system? Are they, I mean, I'm just trying to imagine how they transact.
Okay, I'm having a little difficulty here in the front here. What,
You can't hear me?
not all that well. What was the question again? I'm sorry.
I'm just curious about how money plays into this, as far as the peasants that you kicked off this land that's getting fumigated. Does the government assume that they don't own the land anyway because maybe they didn't?
Okay, so kind of what happens to the land and how does that play into the whole?
Well, the money part of it. I mean,
Okay.
do they own this land?
Okay.
A deed or something?
Okay.
All that.
Me estoy preguntando un poco sobre la cuestión de la plata en todo eso. ¿Por qué se está desplazando la gente por allá? Las fumigaciones y todo eso. ¿Los campesinos tienen títulos a su propiedad o qué pasa con la propiedad? Y tal vez la cuestión de los megaproyectos y el biocombustible.
Claro que sí, los campesinos tienen títulos de sus propiedades.
The peasants do have title to their lands.
El gobierno supuestamente ayuda a los campesinos
Supposedly, the government helps the peasants,
dándoles un subsidio de 10.400.000 pesos para vivienda nueva.
giving them a subsidy of, let's see, doing the translation would be about like $4,000 for new housing.
Después de una serie de papeleos que tiene que hacer el campesino,
After the peasant has gone through a whole series of paperwork hoops,
debe entregar el título de la propiedad de la cual salió desplazado.
and so then they have to show the deed to the land from which they were displaced from.
Podría decirse que eso es como en parte de la cuota inicial del dinero que se le va a dar para la vivienda nueva.
And that could be part of the money that's then used for the new housing.
Pero sucede una cosa, que hay campesinos que tienen 100 hectáreas que están valorizadas en 100 millones de pesos, 200 millones de pesos, entonces pierden su propiedad porque se hacen como un intercambio.
So, but there could be a case where peasants have maybe like 100 or 200 hectares of land that might be worth 100 or 200 million pesos, which is a little bit more than I'm able to do the calculation on right now. But it'd be like tens of thousands of dollars. But so basically, they've lost that. They exchanged that title for the land where they had been previously to get new land that doesn't have the same value as where they were displaced from.
Después de que el campesino acepta llenar el papeleo para el subsidio de vivienda nueva, pues automáticamente pierde el derecho de la propiedad y eso pasa a ser del gobierno.
So then obviously after the peasant goes through all of that paperwork, they lose the right to the land that they had previously, which then goes into government hands.
How and when did the Peasants Association form?
¿Cuándo y cómo se formó la asociación campesina?
La Asociación Campesina de Arauca se formó en 1999.
So the Arauca Peasant Association was formed in 1999.
Se hizo una reunión de todos los principales municipios del departamento
So there was a meeting of all of the main counties in the state
con líderes de juntas comunales.
with leaders from the neighborhood and community councils.
Esta propuesta salió de todos estos líderes, pues empezando como a construir una alternativa nueva.
And so this proposal came from all of those community leaders wanting to be able to construct an alternative proposal.
Y la visión inicial de la asociación era muy diferente a lo que estamos luchando ahora.
And the initial vision of the Peasant Association was very different from what we're struggling for now.
La Asociación Campesina de Arauca inicialmente tenía el propósito de trabajar por los campesinos para resguardar los cultivos y toda la agricultura araucana.
And so initially, the Peasant Association had the task in terms of struggling for the peasants, in terms of for the traditional crops and agriculture.
Pero cuando se organiza una asociación como esta, entonces empiezan a ver las represiones y tocó empezar a luchar por la defensa de los derechos humanos y a resguardar la dignidad física de nuestros campesinos.
And so when an association like this is started, well, then there's repression against that association, so the association began to have to work for human rights and for the dignity of the members.
Democráticamente en Colombia nosotros tenemos derecho a existir.
Democratically there in Colombia, we have the right to exist.
Incluso nosotros estamos protegidos supuestamente por el Estado.
And we're even supposedly protected by the government.
La primera presidenta de la asociación, Luz Perdi Córdoba,
The first president of the association, Luz Perli Córdoba,
tiene un proceso por rebelión de 5 años.
she was charged with rebellion 5 years ago.
Las medidas cautelares en Colombia, los sindicalistas tenemos derecho a tener escoltas.
So as in terms of precautionary measures for people in Colombia, as unionists, we have the right to have bodyguards.
Y otras cosas, pero los escoltas fueron, o sea, todo eso es como una trampa de parte del gobierno.
But all this is kind of like a trick by the government, a trap.
Los escoltas de Luz Perli fueron los testigos en contra de ella para poder judicializarla.
The bodyguards that Luz Perli was assigned by the government then became the witnesses that were used in the process against her.
En estos momentos ella se encuentra exiliada en Suiza.
And right now she's in exile in Switzerland.
Y por supuesto, pues enfrentando un proceso que está entre más días, le salen más testigos y más pruebas en contra.
And so as that process goes on, well, then there are more witnesses that appear and more people, more supposed evidence against her. Mm-hmm. Let's see, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so first off, thank you very much. And then also, my question would be, in the pictures, there was that vehicle with that acronym ACNUR. And it sounded like that was a UN program. Are there any other UN programs, like specifically delegated to help with like organizations like the Peasant Association?
Y parece que era una organización de las Naciones Unidas y hay otras organizaciones de las Naciones Unidas que están trabajando por allá y apoyando la asociación campesina.
¿Me lo pregunta o me lo dice?
Sí, a usted.
Sí, todas las organizaciones de Naciones Unidas están haciendo acompañamiento. Ellos especialmente están ayudando a las organizaciones sociales cuando sus líderes son capturados.
So all of the United Nations organizations are supporting the process. They particularly help out when the leaders of the social organizations are arrested.
Cuando se denuncia rápido, pues ellos pueden tomar como el control. Ellos están designados para vigilar que el proceso se lleve dentro del marco legal.
And so when there's a mass arrest, or when there is arrest, and there's a denunciation about that very quickly, well, then the United Nations can get involved and to monitor that process so that it hopefully goes correctly.
Otras de las organizaciones internacionales que nos están ayudando es la Federación Luterana Mundial.
Another international organization that's supporting us is the Lutheran World Federation.
Unión Europea.
The European Union.
Cruz Roja Internacional.
International Red Cross.
Y por supuesto Naciones Unidas.
And definitely the United Nations. Paul, you had a question?
Si entiendo bien, la relación del gobierno y del ejército contra ustedes como una organización es porque ellos piensan que ustedes están aliados con la guerrilla, aunque no es cierto. ¿Esa es la razón central? ¿O es porque ustedes son una organización progresista?
En parte.
You can do that in English real briefly for folks, Paul. Bien, brevemente en inglés.
The repression of the government and the military against the organization that she is connected with, and other organizations such as hers, is it because the government and the military truly believe that her organization is allied with, working with the guerrilla movements, even though it's patently false? Or is it because her organization is a progressive organization?
Sí, esa es una de las razones que genera la represión. Supuestamente ellos creen que nosotros somos aliados de la guerrilla, somos el brazo político de las guerrillas.
So that's one of the reasons that generate the repression, is that they believe that supposedly we're connected with the guerrillas, we're the political wing of the guerrillas.
Y lo más grande es porque nosotros somos la oposición.
And mainly it's because we are the opposition.
Esa es la razón más fuerte, porque nosotros denunciamos lo que ellos están haciendo.
And that's very great for them, because we denounce what they're doing.
Entonces, pues el Estado necesita mantener una imagen buena ante la comunidad internacional.
And so the government has to maintain a good image internationally.
Y pues lamentablemente nosotros los desmascaramos, así como lo que yo estoy haciendo acá es eso.
And so we basically, take the mask off of them, and basically what I'm doing here.
Yo estoy contando la verdad y pues créame que el gobierno llega a saber esto, pues son problemas para mí, pero realmente no me puedo convertir en cómplice de ellos porque no estoy de acuerdo para nada con lo que ellos hacen.
And so basically what I'm doing here is I'm speaking the truth, and were they to find out about that, that would cause problems for me, but I can't become an accomplice to what they're doing.
María. Sí, buenas noches, muchas gracias también por estar aquí con nosotros. Y quería saber qué rol tiene el narcotráfico en este conflicto particular, en la zona particular de donde tú vienes. Ya sabemos que en diferentes zonas de Colombia y en diferentes momentos ha habido más o menos participación, más o menos alianzas del narcotráfico con la guerrilla o otro tipo de alianzas. ¿Cómo es el escenario en este conflicto en particular?
Si podía hacer la pregunta también para los demás en inglés brevemente.
Yeah, yes, I was asking Lydia what the role of drug trafficking is in this particular conflict. We know that the different scale of intervention and alliances that the guerrilla has had with the narco trafficking. I was curious on what the role was in this particular conflict and this particular region.
En el departamento de Arauca hay narcotráfico bastante.
There is a lot of drug trafficking in Arauca.
Y sí, la guerrilla se está beneficiando de esto.
And the guerrillas are benefiting from that.
En el departamento también el gobierno, llámese alcaldía, gobernación, es lo mismo.
And the government as well, whether that be the municipal government or the state government.
Entonces el narcotráfico, el rol que ejerce en el departamento es el generar recursos para la manutención de los organismos que están armados.
And so drug trafficking there in the state provides support for the armed groups in the state.
Claro que de por medio están los campesinos, ¿no?
And clearly in the middle of this, or in the midst of this, are the peasants.
Porque los campesinos que están todavía en las zonas rurales y que en algunas zonas rurales del departamento hay coca, pues están sobreviviendo de eso porque no tienen más nada en que trabajar.
Because the peasants are there in the countryside, and there is coca there, and that's because the peasants don't have anything else that they can survive off of.
Thank you again for speaking with us today.
Gracias de nuevo por hablar con nosotros hoy en día.
I'm just wondering what, given the statistics that show that the war on drugs is clearly not effective.
Me estoy preguntando, dado que las cifras están mostrando que la guerra contra la droga ha fracasado.
What is your underlying sense of the motivations of the U.S. giving money to Colombia?
¿Qué es su entendimiento sobre la motivación verdadera de los Estados Unidos de dar plata a Colombia si la guerra en contra de la droga ha fracasado y todos saben eso?
Pues en la presentación que hizo Scott, él dio unas cifras.
So in the presentation that Scott gave, he showed some statistics.
El gobierno de Estados Unidos también está recibiendo recursos, ya sea con los helicópteros, con los mercenarios, con el glifosato.
So there are companies that are benefiting from selling the helicopters, the mercenaries, the glyphosate.
Esperamos que la nueva administración cambie.
we're hoping that with the new administration, things will change.
Y realmente nosotros tenemos muchísima esperanza en el nuevo presidente de Estados Unidos.
We do have a lot of hope in the new president of the United States. Any other?
We heard so much about people being arrested and charged for rebellion.
Hemos escuchado tanto sobre la gente que está encarcelada por rebelión.
What's the typical, or I guess the ideal sentence for that? And does it happen to where people can sometimes walk with no punishment from it?
Bueno, aquí es la pena justamente para este delito y algunas personas pueden cometer este delito sin ser condenadas. ¿Cómo es el proceso por lo general con la cuestión de rebelión?
Es que la rebelión es un delito que se inventó el gobierno colombiano para juzgar a los que trabajan en contra, o sea, a los que somos de izquierda.
So the rebellion was a crime invented by the Colombian government for those of us that are part of the left.
La pena que le dan a estas personas es de 6 a 8 años más o menos.
The penalty for the sentence for that is basically usually 6 to 8 years.
También han capturado cabecillas guerrilleros.
There also have been guerrilla leaders who have been captured.
Y así como decía el señor, según ellos, nosotros somos el brazo político de las guerrillas.
And as the man said, that we're considered to be the political arm of the guerrillas.
A los cabecillas guerrilleros también los procesan por rebelión.
The guerrilla commanders are also charged with rebellion.
Pero la verdad es que hasta el momento yo busco y no entiendo eso de rebelión, por exigir nuestros derechos.
So the truth is, I've been like searching and trying to figure out, well, what is this about rebellion? Just for demanding our rights? Let's see, in the back. So if I could write in terms of the English, like if there's a relationship between Spanish guerrilla groups and the guerrillas in Colombia, correct? Or what? Was that the question?
The Spanish oil company.
Okay, thanks very much for clarifying that. Pues sí, una relación entre las petroleras de España.
Los españoles no tienen la culpa de lo que hagan las transnacionales, los estadounidenses no tienen la culpa de lo que hagan la Oxy y las transnacionales.
So the Spanish people are not to blame for what the corporations do, nor the United States people to blame for what Oxy does.
Quiero decirle a usted, creo que es española, no sé si hay más españoles acá, que vivo agradecida de los españoles.
I would like to say to you who is from Spain, I'm not sure if there are other people from Spain here, that I'm very grateful, very appreciative to the people of Spain.
El compañero que estaba fumigando las plantas de yuca es español.
The compañero who is fumigating, applying the fertilizer, the insecticide to the plants is from Spain.
Y gracias a ellos, a los estadounidenses que nos están haciendo acompañamiento.
And thanks to them and thanks to the people from the United States that are accompanying us.
Puedo decir que les debemos nuestras vidas.
I can say that we owe them our lives.
Ellos son como quien dice el pasaporte a la vida para nosotros.
They're like our passport to life.
Entonces, pues nada tiene que ver una cosa con la otra. Lamentablemente, pues hay personas que tienen la cabeza solamente llena de dinero y no les importa. Los demás no tienen la culpa.
So one thing doesn't have to do with another. Unfortunately, there are some people who just have their head filled with money, but that doesn't have to do with the other people.
¿Ustedes han tenido problemas con los guerrilleros también?
Sí, señor. El compañero Carlos Cabrera fue torturado y asesinado por la guerrilla. Supuestamente porque estamos trabajando y pues estamos generando un proceso de producción agrícola y estamos organizando a los campesinos.
So in terms of there's been any repression from the guerrillas as well, and our compañero Carlos Cabrera was assassinated by the guerrillas, and in terms of the reason for that, supposedly that we are generating like an alternative and basically alternatives for the peasants.
Es que en nuestro trabajo también, parte de nuestro trabajo es tratar de concientizar a los campesinos y ofrecerles una alternativa para que ellos salgan de la coca y empiecen a producir alimentos.
So part of our work is to raise the awareness of the peasants and to assist them to stop growing coca and instead to produce food crops.
How much of an effect does the oil line, particularly Occidentals, and the money that the U.S. spends to protect that? How big of a role does that play in Arauca?
Okay. ¿Qué grande es el impacto del oleoducto y la ayuda militar que Estados Unidos está dando para proteger el oleoducto allá en Arauca? ¿Qué tan grande es el impacto sobre la situación allá, el oleoducto y los recursos para proteger el oleoducto allá en Arauca?
¿La producción de petróleo? ¿Sabes?
¿Cómo?
Sí, ¿la producción de petróleo?
Bueno, ¿qué es el impacto de la presencia del oleoducto por allá y la ayuda para proteger el oleoducto?
Pues no sé si le entiende, ¿no? Pero lo que entiendo es el impacto que ha generado la explotación de este mineral.
So I'm not sure if I understand you. Is the question about what has been the impact of the exploitation or the production of that resource?
The money that the U.S. government has spent to protect it.
La plata que los Estados Unidos ha dado para proteger ese recurso y el oleoducto, ¿qué ha sido el impacto de eso?
Pues el impacto es la pobreza que se ha generado porque
The impact is the poverty that's been generated.
Porque donde están los pozos de petróleo, eso era de los indígenas, de los campesinos.
Because where those oil wells are located, that used to be indigenous and peasant land.
Entonces, resulta y pasa de que los indígenas son muy amantes de la tierra.
And the indigenous people very much love the land.
Para ellos el petróleo es la sangre de la tierra.
And for them, oil is the blood of the earth.
No están de acuerdo con que la saquen.
They're not in agreement with that being extracted.
Ellos resistieron para que no se explotara este mineral.
And so they resisted for that resource not to be extracted.
Entonces, pues la alternativa del ejército y de las transnacionales para poder explotar esto era asesinándolos, desplazándolos y generando una guerra terrible.
So the strategy of the corporations and the military was then to just assassinate them and to displace them, a very grave repression.
Lo mismo con los campesinos porque ofrecían dinero para la compra de sus tierras que no costaba eso y pues los campesinos nunca han querido vender sus tierras y pues por resistir pues.
And the same thing with the peasants, offering them prices for their land that was not what the land was worth, and also that the peasants didn't want to sell their land.
Entonces, ¿qué ha ocasionado el dinero que ha dado para eso Estados Unidos? Poder. Y entonces ellos son más fuertes que los campesinos y los indígenas y
And so what has this money, what has been the impact of the money? Well, it's been power for those that receive the money, more power against the indigenous people and the peasants. Maybe one or two more questions to wrap it up here. In back?
Human rights organizations that are helping you, can they go to Congress and speak on their behalf
Las organizaciones de derechos humanos que están apoyando, ellos pueden ir allá al Congreso y hablar a favor de ustedes. Es la pregunta.
Sí, señora, mire. ¿Cuándo fue que vino la alta comisionada?
Eso fue como en noviembre, un poco antes de la redada.
En noviembre del año pasado estuvo la alta comisionada para los Derechos Humanos de Naciones Unidas, una visita supremamente importante para nosotros.
In November of last year, the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations visited Arauca. That was a very important visit for us.
Sucedió que ella habló con el presidente
She spoke to the president
y todos los importantes políticos de Colombia.
And all of the important politicians in Colombia.
Y ella de todo Colombia escogió el departamento de Arauca para visitar.
And out of all of Colombia, she chose Arauca as the state to visit.
Logramos que las víctimas directamente hablaran con ella.
And we were able to obtain or achieve that the victim spoke directly with her.
Y luego las organizaciones sociales tuvimos el placer de hablar también y presentarles toda la información.
And then we, as the social organizations, had the pleasure of speaking with her and presented her with all of the information.
Ella habló con el gobierno y Se habló de las capturas masivas.
So she spoke with the government, she spoke about the mass arrests.
El gobierno, pues, para salir bien con ella, me imagino que dijo que sí, todo bien chévere.
And so the governor, I imagine, to be on good terms with her, said, everything is just fine.
Pero después, pues, en el municipio de Arauquita capturaron al presidente, al señor, al médico y a 12 personas más que son dirigentes sociales. O sea que el gobierno aplica esto, dice pero no cumple.
But then shortly after that, the government carried out the mass arrest in Arauquita, in which the leader of the human rights organization was captured, a doctor, and 12 other community leaders. So the government says one thing, but it doesn't follow through on its word.
Venga, les cuento, mire, la estrategia del gobierno es la siguiente: ellos capturan a las personas.
So I'll tell you what happens. The government captures people, arrests people.
En un fin de semana cuando no hay oficinas abiertas.
So they arrest them over the weekend when there aren't offices that are open.
Eso lo hacen para poder tener tiempo de empapelar a la gente.
And they do that in order to be able to have time to paper over the people, to be able to generate the paperwork that's needed to justify those arrests.
Porque cuando están capturando a la gente lo hacen sin orden de captura.
Because when they arrest the people, they do that without arrest orders. So maybe one more question, then we can just kind of continue the conversation here informally. If anybody's got a final one.
Can I do it in Spanish now, right?
Sure. If you could just translate into English for everybody else afterwards.
Muchas gracias por venir. Yo siento muchísimo por todas sus pérdidas. Quisiera hacer algo para ayudar directamente un día si puedo, y entonces mi pregunta es, aunque hay peligro en todas partes, especialmente en Arauca, ¿cree usted que una persona de los Estados Unidos puede entrar ya en Arauca y trabajar junto con una organización como suyo para los derechos humanos con un nivel de seguridad? Es que los voluntarios, por ejemplo los de los UN, pueden operar sin mucho peligro a ustedes. So what I asked is it possible, do the people who are volunteering there, like people from the UN, people from other non-governmental organizations, are they facing the same level of danger as the citizens there, or are they somehow given a certain level of regard for their lives above those of the community?
Claro que sí.
Very definitely yes.
Son nuestra única opción y para la muestra está Scott.
That's their only option, and one example is Scott.
Y varios americanos y españoles y de varias partes del mundo nunca han tenido problema. A las organizaciones internacionales las respetan bastante.
So various Americans, people from Europe and other parts, and the international folks, they have not had any problems. They've been very respected. Okay, ya para terminar con la presentación formal, algunas palabritas de agradecimiento.
Bueno, entonces muchísimas gracias. Disculpen ahí lo malo. De verdad agradezco el que hayan venido y pues.
Thank you very much. Please excuse any mistakes, anything bad that we did, and I'm very grateful that you've come.
Les voy a pedir un favor de todo corazón.
I'm going to ask you a favor with all of my heart.
Primero que todo agradezco pues el aporte que nos han brindado.
In the first place, I'd like to thank you for the contribution, the support that you've given to us.
Y lo que yo quiero lograr con esto es
And what I want to obtain through this,
que ustedes difundan el mensaje,
that you spread the word,
que le cuenten a sus amigos, a sus familiares.
that you talk to your friends, your family members.
Yo sé que de pronto esta también es una de las partes del plan B para cambiar la situación y espero que algún día alguien de mi país venga a decirles muchísimas gracias, están ayudando y estamos bien y yo sé que eso no se va a lograr de la noche a la mañana.
So this is one of the goals of the tour, and I hope that, for things to change, and I hope that someday somebody from my country can come here and say to you, thank you very much for what's being done there. I know that's not going to happen just from one day to the next.
Pero poquito a poquito se logra. Muchísimas gracias.
But bit by bit, things are achieved. Thank you very much.